Um, Good morning. My name is Lawrence. I'm an addict. Well, I've never shared like this before, so I'm a little bit nervous. I guess my first exposure to the fellowship was probably similar to most people through TV, movies, hearing about people in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I remember as a young kid like seeing this and kind of laughing at it and thinking it was actually quite funny and never really imagining that one day that like my life would depend on this fellowship. And my first exposure as an addict to Narcotics Anonymous came in 1987. I was in a treatment center, and the treatment center was trying to base its program loosely on the NA program. So as a result, they had a Narcotics Anonymous book in the treatment center, and pretty much as far as I knew in those days in Johannesburg, that was the entire fellowship, was this book in this treatment center. And I must admit that when I first read it, I really liked it. I mean, the front cover of the NA book says that a lot has been written about addiction. This book's about recovery. And so from the first word that I read in the book, I could relate to everything I read. But I must say, sadly, that I still rejected NA. And I just couldn't accept. In those days, I used to classify my drugs, and I'd kind of like think that there was a difference between the hard and soft drugs, and that maybe alcohol wasn't really a drug. And my involvement in treatment was basically just in the hope that once I left treatment, I'd be able to use successfully. There was no fellowship in Johannesburg. While I was in treatment, one guy arrived into the treatment center with me, who had been involved in setting up an NA meeting in Durban. I think it must have been in the mid to early 80s. The guy's name was Steve. He became quite famous in a way. And I hated this guy. Well, I liked him, but he just pounded NA at me. And he said to me that there's no ways, and that jails, institutions, and death, and there was no like future for me except this, unless I listened. And along with the fellowship, I rejected him too. And I left that treatment center and went out and used the very next day. And everything they said came true. Like my using got worse. I'd say the period between late 87 to 1990 was probably the 3 worst years or 2.5 worst years of my addiction. In about 89, I was once again approached by somebody because of the fact I'd been arrested, and I was looking at a third conviction and worried about going to jail. So I enrolled at Sanker to try to get hopefully help with my court case. And while I was there, somebody called me in 1989. It was a guy who had just come back from the UK. He had cleaned up in the UK. He was about 4 or 5 years clean. And he wanted to start a similar kind of fellowship out here in Johannesburg. And he asked me if I'd like to get involved. Now at this stage, I mean, I was heavy into my drug use. But at the same time, something about an addict, and this was also another thing, this was the first time that an addict had actually come to me and said to me, you know what, I've cleaned up, and this is the way that I've cleaned up, and I believe that I can help you clean up. So we used to meet in the Sanker building in Johannesburg, and at that stage we weren't even allowed to call it Narcotics Anonymous. I'm not 100% sure exactly why, but it had something to do with the police and Sanker, and worried about it. And we used to meet on a Saturday, I think it was a Saturday morning or a Saturday afternoon, at the Sanker building, and it was a loosely based meeting, not an official NA meeting. And what happened to me was one night we were all going to see this play. That Stephen guy that I mentioned had created a play about drug addiction, and we were all going to go see it. And before I left my house, I had to dose myself before I left, and ended up getting into an accident on the way to meet everybody before we went off to this play. It was playing in Lenasia, if I remember. And that accident, I wrote off my car, pretty much ended my involvement in any attempts at recovery. And I carried on using, and it got worse. I almost died. And in early 1990, I went into rehab again. And I came out of rehab after 3 months, still kind of convinced that I wanted to use. And once again, this guy called me and said, now listen, we've actually got an NA meeting going. And in those days, we used to meet in Hillbrow. We had a meeting on a Monday night at the Hillbrow Recreation Center. And we used to get, I think, my memories of those days are a bit hazy, but I'd say we'd get an average of 6 to 8 people at a meeting, and a big meeting would have 12. and not one of us could say the word anonymity. I remember that was like... But right from the word go, we knew we were onto something special. We knew that like our ability to come into a room and talk about what was going on for us, and for me, having just come out of treatment and being used to the past where you came out of treatment and you were basically thrown back into the real world without any kind of support, to suddenly have a support base. And I only hung around in NA in those days for, I'd say I must have been there for maybe 3 or 4 months. And I was using while I was in. I'd come to meetings and I'd get like a week clean, and then I would use again. Once again with my categorization of certain drugs being soft and certain drugs being hard, and I wanted to just not use those ones, but it was okay to use those ones. And at a certain point, I completely turned my back on NA, and that was also like towards the end of 1990. And I stayed out for another 13 years, and like did a lot of damage to myself, did a lot of damage to my family, my friends, all the consequences that piled on. And in 2003, I came back into the rooms. And it was very different this time. I mean, we had a real fellowship. I mean, there was a fellowship before, but with one meeting a night, it was quite difficult. All of a sudden, you know, the first meeting I went, I think there were 60 people at that meeting. And there was a woman who I kind of knew from my days of using, and she was sharing like 3 years clean. I'll never forget that moment. And just at first I didn't even recognize her, because after 3 years she didn't look like the person that I knew. And it said to me that if she could stay clean, I could. And I guess the message that I've got in my share and what I'd like to talk about is keep coming back, because it'll work, you know. At some stage it can work. And I guess I also want to say that in the rooms we see a lot of people going in and out, and they come into the rooms and they leave the rooms. And I guess my story says that there's hope for all of us, even the people who completely reject NA and leave. And I'm just eternally grateful to this fellowship. Each day I wake up and I express that gratitude, and that gratitude gets shown to me in new ways. Thanks for letting me share.